Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to Matthew Stewart, who is the author of several books, including The 9.9%. And it's a book that I've referred to a lot in my recent work. And I wanted to ask him some questions and talk about the underlying kind of psychology behind some of his observations. And so, I'll start with I'm sure a question you get a lot is like, how exactly are you defining 9.9%? Is it based on income, on wealth, or is it a like professional category?
I see it mainly as a psychology. I don't actually see it as a social class, except indirectly. And my goal in using the economic distributions is really to talk about the way in which inequality affects us. And the central thesis is that it affects us in particular in the way that it drives us all to try to become members of this 9.9%. And then on your more detailed question, I did focus on wealth distributions. I think that's a more interesting category than income distribution, but it's also imperfect. I do want to allow for the many forms of non-monetary wealth and the sort of translations between financial wealth and other forms of wealth that I think matter and affect the psychology.
Yeah, I recently read that the correlation between wealth and income in the United States is zero point 0.5. So, like, we've seen a growing actually separation between, the connection between wealth and income, and there's many different reasons for that. It's interesting because, during the Bernie Sanders campaign, there was a lot about like the 1% versus the 99%. And you're talking about the 9.9% in relationship to the 0.1% and also to the bottom 90%. So I think that creates an important nuance, and it says a lot about our contemporary politics and inequality. So, like, related question is, so I think you argue that it's the dominant ideology. Now, some people would say, well, isn't the 0.1% really the ruling class and therefore has the ruling ideology? But in what ways do you see the 9.9% as kind of having the dominant ideology?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think we should go back just to make sure your viewers are aware of the language we're using here. There's no question that there has been rising inequality, and no question that it's had a huge political impact. But there's also no question that it's not the 99 versus the one. The group that's really benefited and pulled away is the 0.1%. So I think that there's a really strong case to be made that we're seeing the birth of a new oligarchy. And it's something that's happened plenty of times in the past. And the main actors there are the 0.1%. And I don't in my exercise here, I don't intend to take away from that at all. In fact, I think that if you're asking me politically, what's the most salient feature of inequality, it's going to be the rise of this super wealthy elite that then have a tremendous amount of power in the political system and over public discourse. But my focus is on, as I said, the psychology, and it's how inequality affects us. It affects all of us, and I think that that's an important mechanism. And in a way, that's a crucial part of the power of the 0.1%. I mean, they can't rule everything by themselves. They need to have a kind of supporting cadre. And so, Marx said that the ruling ideas are ever the ideas of the ruling class. It's actually a little more subtle than that because we're not actually dealing with the ideas of the 0.1% for the most part. We're dealing with the ideas of the group just below, which is much larger, although it's still an elite of sorts. And so I think it's the values and ideas and complexes specific to that group that matter, that are really important for the system and that affect all of us. And I also see it as part of the way to break out because, to some extent, this culture of the 9.9% is complicit in escalating inequality, complicit in putting the 0.1% in power. And so there's stuff that we can do about it. And so that's why I want to focus on it. So it's a complex picture. I don't think there are easy answers here, but I hope that there's enough that people can see that the change in the underlying economics, the change in the wealth distributions have a real impact on the way people think, the way they act, the way they, as I say in the book, get married and have relationships and deal with other people and, think about what work means and so on.
Yeah, I think, I want to look at parenting, real estate, and education as these three main areas, or three of the main areas I think that you talk about, and how they're all shaped by the 9.9%. But I would just say, like, it's interesting if you look at the culture, we see this growing use of, say, social media, but like YouTube and podcasters, which really help to fuel Trump and the right wing advancement in politics. And so there is this kind of cultural separation where the 9.9% tends to consume, like, you might say, like elite media, like prestige TV. That's what I wrote about. But and then you have this other kind of culture, the 0.1%, which has turned more towards, or has been enabled partially by, like YouTube, podcasts, and more non-traditional forms of mainstream media, and of course also Fox News and talk radio. So I think there are these two different, like, competing, you might say almost ruling ideologies or ruling cultures that are kind of in competition right now. And we see that if you look at the what people consume, where they get their news sources, of course, is highly, like, polarized and segmented. And so I think that's, part of it. But let's first look at higher education, or education in general. It's the field I know most about. I've been teaching at universities for 35 years. I was a faculty union president for 12 years. I worked on some public policy for the Obama administration. So I know a fair amount about the politics. But I think you kind of, like, first of all, you challenge the idea of higher education as a meritocracy, or what's going on with the meritocracy. So maybe you could talk about some of the changes you see that have been connected to inequality and also to higher education.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to look at these things in a very broad sweep of history. Because if you look at it in that sweep, it wouldn't be true to say that education has been the enemy of meritocracy. In fact, it's been the main engine of it, and it was a huge part of the rise of American democracy. And so, without putting on too much rosy-tinted spectacles here, um, a big part of the rise of the middle class in the United States, as imperfect as it was, it involved the rise of the public high school, um, and then involved the rise of the state university system starting in the middle of the 19th century, and then with a huge boost in the post-war period. So, the basic truth, the same thing you see in like Pericles' funeral oration or something like that, that education is the key to democracy and liberty. I think that's all true. But that makes the past 30 or 40 years particularly tragic because what we have seen is, in fact, a tremendous reversal. Um, where higher education, instead of really scooping up a lot of people who otherwise would not have entered into a higher level or more economically rewarding professions, were scooped up. Just as we're losing that system of public secondary education that would create this broad middle class, and instead, what we're seeing is a state university system that looks more and more like a kind of soft copy of the private system, where you have super fancy and expensive high-end boutiques, and then you have other services that cost more and more money and leave students massively in debt. I mean, all this story. And then, of course, you have this elite private sector that is much as they try to be very, humane and progressive in their choice of who they let in, at the end of the day, they are offering a system that provides, cultural capital and prestige to those who can figure out how to get in. And those who can figure out how to get in, it turns out overwhelmingly or disproportionately are the people who have a lot of resources to begin with. So, it ends up becoming a system that is less a meritocracy and more a way of reproducing class privilege. And there are a lot of numbers to back this up. I don't think it's like completely gone. I think there's still something there. I wouldn't blow up the system, um, but there's a lot that could be done to bring it back to its original promise.
Right. Well, I wrote this book called Educating Inequality, and one of my arguments is that it's hard to educate people in a highly unequal society because that inequality tends to restructure things. If you look at, like the California Master Plan for Higher Education, which I think probably people saw themselves as progressives who put it together, the idea was like the top 10% of students in each high school would go to University of California campuses. The next 20% or so would go to California State University, and then the rest would go to community college. And um, the result is that we have this highly segregated and segmented and hierarchical system where it tends to, compound people's family wealth and status, and that there are still, some social and economic mobility, but for the vast majority of people, the system creates this kind of separation. And so like a lot of the like resentment you see in the working class and why people often, support, or some people support like someone like Trump who says I love the uneducated, he was tapping into something that's partially true, right? That a lot of people have been excluded by the system. A lot of people have gone, student debt is now $1.7 trillion, right? So a lot of people got into tremendous debt. Only a third of Americans have, I think, bachelor's degrees or higher. A lot of people enter college and don't graduate because they can't afford it. And so, in a way, like, yes, the system is broken. And I think part of the what interests me about this kind of like I call it like centrist psychology of the 9.9% is that, and you talk a lot about this. In some ways, they're blind to these problems, and I think one of the issues is that this class has a high level, I would say, of narcissism. I think people misunderstand what narcissism is. So it often is like status anxiety that people, the upper middle class, they're afraid of, falling into the lower classes or poverty, and they desire to, attain a higher class. So there's this constant anxiety, and I think that's a big part of it, right? That drives this related issue. You call it I think the Menlo doctrine. Is that what you call it? The of
Yeah,
parenting.
well, I was making fun of one particular person, this mother in Menlo Park who had a kind of fanatical approach to parenting. Yeah, but that's a separate thing. We should talk about parenting. But on the education, how are you connecting this to the education topic?
Well, that's first of all the politicians. Um, like I think you mentioned this, like they think because they were successful in the meritocratic higher education system that everyone can be, but also this idea that they don't want to deal with problems or the failures of their own policies. Like I did research and showed that like over like 2 decades, the United States spent over $2 trillion on all forms of financial aid, including subsidizing and processing student loans and institutional aid. $2 trillion to make higher education more affordable and accessible, and the opposite happened. So that's a huge public policy failure. And the question is like, well, why does this continue? And why have like, starting with LBJ, LBJ said that the solution to our economic and social problems is education only. He said people don't need a handout, they need education. So education, as you're saying, has been part of the solution, but only part of the solution. And so the problem is like, why do politicians keep on like especially Democratic politicians, doubling down as education as a solution if, as we're saying, it actually has, on average, decreased economic mobility and increased inequality. So why do they continue pursuing these policies that are counterproductive? Maybe they're productive for their group and they were productive for themselves, but also I think another issue is part of this psychology is people don't want to admit that their policies were wrong, and they just double down on them, and that there's enough evidence now that these policies have failed largely, and so the question is like, why in this class you see this in all these issues you look at on some level they're aware of inequality, but on the same level they perpetuate it, and that's the
Yeah,
conflict.
yeah. Well, that's because the ideology that people buy into in this 9.9% is that education does solve every problem and everyone succeeds in direct proportion to their level of education. But it turns out that there are other systemic factors that completely mess that up. So, for example, if as society becomes more unequal, the distribution of rewards becomes naturally much, much more unequal. So you have a smaller number of super high rewarding slots and a much larger number of not very rewarding slots. So in that context, educating a whole bunch more people is basically preparing a whole bunch of people for not succeeding because they're going to incur whatever costs are associated with the education. And there isn't going to be anything waiting for them when they get out because it's only going to a very small sliver of people at the top. And at the very same time, it's going to make the competition within the education space unbelievably brutal and intense because if you don't make it into that little sliver at the top, then you don't get any of the real prestige value of having the education. And that's why you see that now in the system that we have that,
Right.
the people who get the key to enter into those hallowed precincts up there in the top few percentiles are only the ones who go, or not only, but they're disproportionately the ones who go to the elite universities, or at least there's a distinct advantage in that. And so the competition to get into those is incredibly brutal. And it also has very little to do with actual education. It doesn't really have very much to do with what they learn or, critical thinking or, all these other, wonderful buzzwords. It just has to do with the fact there are very few slots and whoever can accumulate the most status or prestige will get those slots and everyone else is going to be messed up. And so your education policy, the idea that, well, we'll solve it all by just educating more and more people ends up not being a solution, right? It ends up being, in fact, a way of driving up costs. Also, if you do it in a way where you're just turning on the spigot and saying, you can borrow as much money as you want and get as much education as you want. Well, if you haven't figured out what's going to happen after, with that education, then you're just setting up a lot of people to accumulate debt that is never going to be repaid. And you're also encouraging institutions to build up, these elaborate programs that are not necessarily resulting in all that much for the people who are going there. So, I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes you have to make like hard. I mean, look, so I live in Europe now, and I have to say it's not that the systems here are perfect, but they are a little more honest about a couple of things. One is that they are much more rigorous about the testing requirements and the other sort of non-subjective factors that decide who gets in. Now, these factors are they're highly problematic, and they also often involve reproducing class structures. But they at least have the virtue of being agreed upon by most members of society as marking out people as being um, uh, you know, worthy of a spot at university, and they, have made efforts and they've shown that lets in a fair number of people from, different socioeconomic groups. So there's that. There's less of the kind of hierarchy, and most of the European countries have these state university systems where there's some that are better than others, but not quite the extremities that we have. The costs are far more reasonable, much, much lower. And there's still some sense that it's a public service, right? Whereas the American concept, which again goes back to this ideology of the 9.9%, is that it's all you, it's all the individual. Your education is what you pay for, what you get. How well you do is just how smart you are, and how much you earn is the result of your own intrinsic virtue. So I think if you look at it from the distance, you can see how it's gone awry. I think the main factors making it go awry are structural. When you have this growing inequality, it's very hard to have an educating system. I like the title of your book. I think it actually makes a point that it's hard to educate people in a very unequal world because there's a lot of forces that are working against it.
The
So
other flip side of I was using that as a double like meaning, like educating inequality is like so much of what education is about now, starting K through 12, is competing for scarce resources, scarce grades, scarce admissions. And so it creates this, it socializes people to accept this inequality and this scarcity model. And that then reflects, but for me, like for a long time, I was the president of a union that represented the non-tenured faculty at the University of California, right? There was like 5,000, or it went up to 8,000. And so like universities, so we see these as these bastions of liberal culture, whatever, how we want to define that, liberal ideology, liberal culture. But they have the most like incredible like labor exploitation of their own faculty, of students, interns, student workers, graduate students, and then a whole class of working class people, often, underpaid or undervalued. And so that's one of the paradoxes. You have this system of meritocracy and the system of liberalism, um, but it's run on its own like incredible inequality. And then like, so then how do the faculty and administrators, deal with that, like cognitive dissonance, this fact that, you know, they spend so much time talking about equality and social mobility, and their own institutions are incredibly unequal, and I think that's,
So how do they deal with it? I'm really fascinated by that because I mean it's so blindingly obvious. If you look at the American universities from the outside and you see that between 50 and 75% of the faculty are adjunct faculty and they have no job security, no health insurance. I mean it is as you say incredible. So how do the how do all the
well,
people
for
that
a lot of the faculty who do have like tenure and have good positions, I think they say like, well, it's meritocracy. They have the talents. They won the lottery. I don't think they think of it as like. So we had, I taught for 10 years at UCLA, and I was on a lot of like committees where they're talking about funding fellowships for different programs. And like, so I was at one meeting where they're talking about like they wanted more fellowships for students in German, but like no students have gotten like a good job in teaching German in like years, right? Because they just rely on part-time faculty, and there's no good tenured professorships at, especially at elite institutions. Um, but everyone thinks like their students will make it, right? And they
yeah.
also they want to teach graduate seminars with, so they need graduate students, right? They also don't want to
Yeah.
teach undergraduate
So then they
courses.
add to the problem. They basically overproduce PhDs. Yeah.
But I think part of this is this kind of like moral blindness, like that, that is often like then compensated by virtue signaling.
Hmm.
Like, they'll talk about like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but their own systems fuel both like in their missions policies and in their hiring practices, they they fuel inequality. And so a lot of times it seems like you have these very elite professors talking about, diversity and equity, but they're actually, partially responsible for the system that enhances inequality, right?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that we can bracket the politics of DEI and woke, but just make the point that uh, often it is used as a way of camouflaging a system that is quite unjust, quite unfair, and the compensation for that is, well, but we are incredibly conscientious in letting people of all different types into our very unfair and unjust system. So, I mean, essentially, it's kind of like covering up one injustice with, something else,
Like
right?
Harvard likes to say, oh, if you make less than $100,000 a year, your family has less than $100,000 a year, you can go to school for tuition free at Harvard. But it's like less than five. I think the Ivies have less than 5% of the students come from like the bottom 50% of the income bracket. So,
Well, it's actually no, it's weirder than that. I mean, and it is really kind of strange. You have at places like Princeton, they've actually consciously raised that number. So the bottom quintile of the income distribution now is fairly well represented at some of these Ivy League universities. I'm not sure what the exact number is now, but I've seen like 15 or 17% of the students coming from families that meet certain kinds of low income thresholds. But then what happens is that once they've satisfied themselves that they've met that requirement and got their economic diversity, everyone who's just above that cutoff, all the families in the second, third, and fourth quintile, they get screwed. They're just out.
Right.
And then back in the top quintile, all of a sudden, it's glory days. So you end up with a student body that is very strange because you've got this chunk of low income students, and they're actually often identified. It's like they have special acronyms, first generation, and they have some other funny acronyms. I can't remember what they were called, but so you have that group, and then you just have the preponderance of the population being, disproportionately wealthy, crazy wealthy, basically.
Well, what was partially driving this? I saw this at UCLA on the admissions policies when UCLA started to be, I think it was now rated the top public university, So the rankings really drive a lot of this stuff. And and so in order to, it's changed a little bit, but like 15 years ago, like SAT scores were the highest indicators of your ranking. And SAT scores are highly correlated with the wealth of the parents for many different reasons. And so what you're basically doing is you're basing the rankings on the wealth of the parents, right? And so you're going to perpetuate that. And so what they did at UCLA, they would say like, well, the first 25%, because we want to keep our rankings up, we're just going to base it totally on SATs. Then the next 25% will take SATs and GPAs, right? And then we'll have like a bottom 25% of like, it'll be some, we'll take into consideration like class and race. They do it by what neighborhood you went to, your high school went to, what the funding of the high school is. But also, we need people to play trombone. We need a middle linebacker. We need, and in the Ivy League schools, a lot of it is the legacy admissions, right? Which really, some of it is a very high level legacy admissions, which really perpetuates the wealth inequality. And so just a totally it's internally stratified. And then you have, like I was saying, University of California system, you have stratified by, top universities, private universities, the flagship public universities, the middle universities, public universities, and then the community colleges. And they're also like highly segregated in many ways, de facto segregated, because in the United States, there still is a high correlation between wealth and race. And so some people argue one of the solutions, I think you mentioned something like a lottery admissions for private universities, right? Is that one of the things that you were?
Yeah, I think I threw that out there. I mean, to be honest, I don't see a magic bullet. Another thing I threw out there is, I think things went awry back when George Washington didn't get his federal university. I think that would be a great thing. I mean, it's not going to happen, I suppose, but I think a national public option would be really cool, and it would kind of force a degree of rationalization on some of the existing systems, and if it were done right, it could actually become a very low cost form of giving prestige, in the same way that some of the European countries have national universities that are the most prestigious. But there are other solutions. But I have to say, if you focus on the admissions, you're giving a little bit too much to the that other blind spot that you mentioned. So you can come up with the best admissions policy in the world, and I'm sure you can come up with something that's better than what we have now. But unless you change the society that they're going into,
Yeah.
it's you're just going to end up reproducing the problem in some other way. And this is where the blind spot, I think, is so telling, because you have these people in the system, like the professors you mentioned, who say, well, it's merit. I happen to be a tenured professor, and the 75% of my colleagues who have PhDs, well, they're on the breadline and living in their cars because they just don't have my level of merit. Well, that you have to say, well, how is it that you're not able to explain then the fact that 40 years ago the numbers were reversed. I mean, did merit suddenly become that much more, unevenly distributed in society than it was 40 years ago? How is it that the same weird distributions aren't happening in other countries? It's this kind of assumption that the system, because it's all very carefully monitored, because we have tests, because we have admissions departments, because we think about these things,
Mm.
that it all must work and everybody must end up with exactly what they deserve. That's the blind spot that I think that we have to grapple with as a society. And so honestly, like if you want to solve the education problem, there are many steps you can take within the university world, but there are also many bigger steps that you have to take outside of it. I mean, until you
Totally
end up with a
agree. Yeah.
society where the distribution of rewards is a bit more just.
And I
Um,
once was talking to a state senator from California, and I asked her what percentage of jobs in California do you think are high tech jobs? And she said something like 20%, and it's like 5%,
yeah.
And and so a big issue that happens, especially, 21st century, saw it increasingly, is that there just weren't enough like jobs, that would traditionally require bachelor's degrees, and they weren't well paying jobs. And so people were requiring bachelor's degrees to work at Starbucks, to work at the front counter of a health club. And so you have this problem where if you look at, say, the California, a lot of the blue states, it's really exaggerated, is you have this incredible inequality, and especially like job inequality, in the sense that the vast majority of workers, like 70%, are retail workers, service workers, or low wage workers. And 50 years ago, they might have been in unions, right? And they're not in unions anymore, or very few are in unions, even in blue states. In red states, not at all, right to work states. It's very hard to have unions and have any union power. So I agree. This is why I call it, like, it's hard to have an equal education system or meritocratic education system if you have an unequal society, because of all these things, both like before they get to school, it's unequal. Their education is unequal. It's often based on, like, the school funding is based on property taxes, and so you have the whole real estate issue and wealth segregation issue. And then, when they graduate, the jobs, um, there's just not a lot of like well-paying jobs. And so then you have people who graduate with student debt, high levels of student debt, if they do graduate, and most of them don't graduate, but if they do graduate, then there's just not a lot of well-paying jobs. And I think most Americans don't get that. They don't. I think it's part of the fantasy ideology of maybe meritocracy, is people just don't really accept that we have like a low wage economy.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. Well, and as you say, also they're kind of educated from early on to believe in this world of resource scarcity, right? So
Right.
they think everything is an intense, tough competition, and if you have that mentality, then you just sort of take for granted that most people are going to be roadkill, and you know, yeah, and so you get what you deserve, right? So
So if we let's move to like parenting, at least, because I think, this is also related to, it compounds it, and is also a like of an effect of inequality. You have this double thing, and you have this pressure, like this one single narrative for people, like you have to, get good grades in K through 12, go to a good school, and then you'll get a good job, and then you'll be happy and whatever. And I think that it is true for some people, but for most people, it's not true.
yeah,
So,
yeah. And I mean, so there, I mean, a couple of things going on. One is that there is a fair amount of sociology that makes this really simple point, and I almost have to apologize because this analysis is just so simple, but I just think it's true. It's that if you compare different systems or economies around the world, you'll find that some of them have what's called intensive parenting. So the parents are, extremely focused on the kids, invest huge resources, spend a lot of time, obsess about their education and so on. So we're all pretty familiar with that intensive parenting model. Some of them have more intensive parenting than others, and there's a pretty strong correlation. I mean, the best explanatory value is very simply income inequality. So in or and also one presumes wealth inequality. basically where you have very unequal systems, it's just a matter of straightforward logic that the parents are going to think, well, if my kid doesn't, make it into that top decile, they're screwed. So I've just got to keep on going. And by the way, my own status depends to some extent on how well my kids do. So I don't look so good if my kids don't do so well. So they just massively overinvest. They have tremendous anxiety. They develop, that kind of narcissism of status anxiety and so on. And that drives this cycle of intensive parenting. So that's one simple part of the story. And then there's another really important piece of the story that I think everyone's familiar with, or at least people who've lived a certain amount of time. Um, and that's kind of the change in the relationship between family and workforce, or between the
Mm.
family and the economy. So, and it's hard to state this without sounding like some kind of reactionary, but there was you can argue that for all the many flaws and prejudices in an earlier system, there was some recognition of the value of care, of child care and so on, or of resources invested in taking care of a family.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, Whereas when we move towards a uh, totally individualistic model of employment, where it doesn't matter what your sex is or what your family position is, you're just a worker and you just get paid. Um, that family business kind of dropped out of the equation. So essentially, married people found that they had to both had to have incomes if they were going to sustain their lifestyle, and no one was really getting paid for the childcare. Now, that system works really well for high income people, or at least works reasonably well. They find ways of having, usually if they're high enough income, they can find some ways of having time off. In any case, they have the resources to pay for nannies and care and so on. And so, of course, driven by this inequality and this need to make their kids succeed, they're able to make it work. They create this model of parenting perfection. Um, and I suppose that if everybody could do that, if our society were somehow wealthy enough, you could still argue whether it's a great system, but at least it would be reasonably fair. But it turns out it doesn't work for the majority of the population. It's just too hard. I mean, it's just there's just you don't make enough money with two median incomes to do the childcare and to work a decent job. And so you're basically doing extra work. And so parents are unbelievably stressed. They're incredibly unhappy. They report that having children was like the worst decision of their life. Um, and then of course you end up with a lot of single parents because they don't find spouses who are going to help out with the parenting burdens. So I think when you put those two things together, the drive for intensive parenting, and then the rearrangement of the economics of family and child rearing, um, you get a parenting situation that is pretty far from ideal, right?
Well,
So.
I'm teaching a seminar now on college mental health, and I just published a book on college mental health crisis. And, and so the big debate in this area is, what has caused the increased level of anxiety and depression in young adults, in college students? And there's a lot of work that says it's technology, the smartphone, and I think that does play a role, but there's also a lot of research in changing in parenting. And so you have this intensive kind of like paranoid parenting style. And the question is why do young people today, they've basically stopped leaving their rooms. Like they don't drink as much, they don't have sex as much, they don't even get their driver's license. They have very few friends. They socialize very little. And they get to college and they're completely inexperienced in all these things, and they're used to self-isolating. So some of it is the attraction, the phone or the laptop. They can access everything from there. They don't have to leave their room. But then there's also this underlying idea that, well, um, parents don't want them to leave. Like there's been such a media of paranoia, of fear, like of crime, of child abduction, of the unsafe outside world. The media feeds off of negative news, which creates this paranoid mindset. So some of it is like the idea of helicoptering parents. It's like, okay, we want our students, our kids to be good students, to be successful. So we make sure that they, for the upper middle class, I think it's a lot about, yeah, they take ballet class, they take SAT prep courses, and they're on all these teams, and they have all scheduled free time is all scheduled and adult supervised, right? And they're not just out on their own experimenting, taking risks, learning, interacting with people. I think that's part of it. And it's also that there's just so many aspects of society that motivate like young people to like just stay alone at home on their phones. And so I think that compounds all these like pre-existing problems and makes it even more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see some more detailed analysis of this debate about technology versus intensive parenting as the source of these mental health troubles. Because I'll tell you, I'll reserve judgment until I see, the full analysis. But my inclination is to favor overwhelmingly the change in parenting style as the source of the trouble. Now, I'm sure a case can be made for the technology stuff. Some of the things I've seen, like that popular book by Jonathan Haidt,
Right.
I found really kind of uncompelling, not very compelling in terms of the argument, and a lot of kind of confirmation bias in the way the evidence is being interpreted.
Hmm.
Um, uh, for me personally, the confirmation bias is going to work the other way because I just know anecdotally of so many kids who have absorbed this message from their parents. The message that they're getting is this world is cruel and unforgiving. Because if you don't make the cut, if you don't, get into that decile, if you don't get into the good university, if you don't get the good grades, you are going to die. So there's that message. And then the other message, which is even stranger and more subtle, and parents often aren't aware of it, is that you have to fake your way through life. Because, of course, nobody um, very few people identify completely with the great scholar or the great humanitarian or whatever it is that the kids are supposed to turn themselves into. And so what you really end up doing is telling the kids, okay, the world's incredibly cruel, and the only way you make it through is by concocting this hallucination, that other people can, temporarily believe in long enough for you to survive. And that works for some kids, but for a lot of many kids, I'm sure it leaves them deeply troubled. They don't know who they are, but they know that there are a lot of evil forces out there. So for me, at least anecdotally, I'm just much more drawn to that other parenting, the hypothesis about parenting and the general social economic changes as being the driving force and not technology. That's not to say, though, that technology isn't playing a contributing role, and I certainly am. I look forward to seeing more evidence on it. But I have to say, some of the counter evidence I thought was pretty striking. That some of the studies that claim to show the effect of cell phone use turns out that even in kids who don't have the cell phones, you see some of the same uh, uh, consequences, right? So but I don't know the details well enough to comment on it too much. Just to say that I have this certain predisposition to favor one side of that argument.
Well, one of the things that Haidt and other people, I wrote a chapter of a book on Haidt and like his earlier work, and he just like doesn't take into account like inequality, at all, and these larger social forces, right? And so, that would be like a huge, you know, factor. And you you look at a book like The Culture of Narcissism. It's really interesting. Christopher Lasch. He's dealing with a lot of some of the same issues, but he did have a kind of an idea of like economics and inequality and the social aspects of it that were also part of his work. And I think that's dropped out of a lot of these people who want to just focus on technology and what is the economic, the social, like the larger cultural, social forces, not just parents and not just technology, but like we're saying, what do you do in a society where there's no longer really any middle class? I think that's the key thing is like the middle class, which
Well,
was partly built. Yeah.
here's another one of my prejudices, which I'll share with you. When I hear people attributing these major changes to technology, I immediately get suspicious. My hackles go up because I see most of these technology narratives as attempts to naturalize what are really human created problems. So when they attribute it to technology, what they're implicitly saying is, oh, well, it's just built into the laws of nature. I mean, as we go on this amazing journey where we discover new gadgets and come up with new ways of doing things, lo and behold, something bad happens in our social arrangement. We created this monstrous new little device that acts like a virus, and it's destroying us all. And that's usually wrong. That's usually a way of pretending that the problems are visiting us from the outside, when in fact they may well be issues that are coming from the inside. And just specifically on the question of technology, it's not the fact that we have these little computers in our hands that's the technology of concern. It's the social media, and that social media is very much a matter of human choice and policy choice. We didn't have to have an ad-driven system for connecting people through social media. There are plenty of other ways that you could imagine using the same digital technologies to connect people rather than having a monopoly or a set of a nice little cartel organizing these processes and doing it for the extraction of data that can be then exploited and used to manipulate people. So I mean, we're taking stuff that's a lot of these technology narratives, they drive me nuts because they're kind of ways of pretending that it's like, oh, the rain came and then people got sad, you know and
Well,
that
but you looked at like Trump's inauguration thing, you have these Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, they're all basically owners of these huge social media platforms, technology platforms. And so, a huge issue is just the monopolies, right? And the whatever happened to antitrust legislation, like did that like, you know, 1910 or whatever, like did like they just give up on that? Like was I
Yeah,
guess
well,
they broke up.
now you're getting to what I think of as the meat of the issue, which is not technology per se. It's actually our economic and political policy. So when I look at that lineup there at the inauguration, I don't see like a bunch of super engineers. I see the latest iteration of monopolists. I
Right.
mean, these are people who have figured out how to rise to the top of a monopoly. Now, the opportunity for that monopoly to some degree is created by technology because most of these digital technologies naturally have networking effects. So whoever gets the network then dominates. But we could come up with ways of making sure that people don't use that to exploit the rest of society. But we didn't. Instead, what we said is, oh, great. If you find this monopoly and you create it, you basically can tax the rest of society, and then you become this great big mogul, and everybody thinks you're a genius, and you get to go to the inauguration, and then you get to pay to have the government produce policies that will entrench your position as a monopoly. So I don't see that. Yes, the story begins with the arrival of a new technology, but there are all the choices that matter, the choices about the economic policy, and the antitrust is the biggest one. It's the biggest one by far, and I don't think this is any big secret. I mean, it's been out there. Um, there have been efforts to deal with it. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Lena Khan working in the Biden administration, and I know that she made some moves, but I think there's way more to be done, obviously. It seems clear to me that part of what's going on with the Trump thing is really, basic monopoly stuff. I mean, what does Mark Zuckerberg want? He wants to make sure that no one undoes his totally monopolistic and egregious merger with or acquisition of Instagram and the other social media apps that he used essentially to kill off competition and establish a monopolistic position in social media. So um, and that to me, I think gets at the core of this problem that we're talking about. If we're looking for solutions, I think that's where I'd go hunting on the material side. Now, I think there's a lot that we can do on the cultural side too. I don't think that it's just about the economic policy arrangements, but those are the big ones.
You know, what most people don't understand, and very few people really do not understand this at all, is like what the quantitative easing. Okay, so after the 2008 crash, right, the Federal Reserve basically lent interest-free trillions of dollars to large corporations and financial institutions. And what many of them did was buy their own stocks to increase the value of their stocks. $6.3 trillion was spent, okay, on stock buybacks, okay, mostly funded by the federal government, which raised the stock market, you know, raised the valuation and, of course, the executive compensation. Jeff Bezos takes very little of his pay in income, right? This is one reason for the income wealth disparity. He takes it in stock options and investments, right? And so the way that executives, you know, increase their profits, personal profits, right, is through the increase in their stock value. And then they use the way wealthy people enhance their wealth for the most part. I really didn't know this until recently, is they basically finance everything through debt. And so they use their assets as collateral to get cheap and easy money to invest, and then they don't have to pay taxes on their stocks if they don't trade them in. And so they use them as assets and to get more money, to get more investments, to buy more things and things that appreciate and that they can make money. So the and in the pandemic too, they did the same thing, quantitative easing four. They another, you know, $1 trillion at least of money, easy money that went to these financial institutions. So it really was like the in response to these crises, they really did bail out the banks and because they were too big to fail, and the financial institutions and the corporations. And like what I didn't know is like every night corporations borrow billions of dollars on the overnight lending window. And what really caused the 2008 crisis was that lending froze up, a liquidity trap. So there was no money. And so that's why they all had to be bailed out. But, you know, so you see this incredible situation where the wealthy just get, they call it like a no risk casino, right? But for like the average American, I think 40% of Americans have less than $400 in the bank. And if they have a flat tire, they're in a financial crisis, right? They're not getting bailed out. If they have a medical health problem, they're not getting bailed out. They have student debt, well, Biden tried to bail out a small percentage of them, but they're basically not getting bailed out. And so once again, that is a huge driver of social insecurity, anxiety, you know, inequality is compounded that way.
Yeah, but I mean, the unfortunate part of the story that you tell is that people have convinced themselves, or too many people, I think, have convinced themselves that we have a free market and that the distribution of rewards reflects just the glories of the market. In fact, the biggest concentrations of wealth are the result of the kind of process you're describing, which is where the risks are socialized. So you get debt, but it's government debt. They're basically gonna they take all the risk. And that happens more broadly than quantitative easing, by the way. I mean, all banks in the United States, as in around the world, are essentially backstopped by the government, and they get their deposits. The biggest part of the money that they lend out, they rely on the Federal Reserve banks to supply that. So they have a way of passing on the risk to the system and actually a constant subsidy for their profits, for their activities. But then, of course, when they make the money, they keep it. And the more they make, the bigger and mightier the CEO is and the senior management, and they tell themselves how great they are, and the business schools all pat them on the back and say that they are geniuses. And so you end up with a small number of people claiming these huge rewards, and yet, strikingly, huge numbers of Americans think that, well, it's a free market, the system works, and so he makes $80 million a year, but he's worth it, because he's, driving up his shareholder value and so on. So I think, that issue of the blind spot again is the one that I wanted to focus on
Yeah,
in
so
this
the
book.
9.9%, for
Um,
instance, like I don't, it's partial blindness, but it's also they profit from it, right? Like you think about real estate, you look at the blue states and the most successful blue states, like economically, like California, New York, Massachusetts, they have incredibly high inequality. They're the highest inequality, right? And they're Democrat states, they're blue states. And part of that is real estate. They have the most inflated real estate values. A lot of people are moving to red states because they have low real housing costs. Um, so, like, what role do you think like real estate plays in shaping this 9.9% like mentality?
Yeah, no, it's huge because, and it's especially a 9.9% thing because the 0.1%, their houses are a tiny sliver of their net worth. So they're not important for them financially, even if they have like 11 houses. So what? Um, and then the people at the bottom of the economic pile, well, they don't have houses, they rent. So they're not part of this picture. But yeah, in the 9.9%, the value of the home is often the single biggest asset. It's the most important one. And historically, it's been the one that's gone up, and it's kind of like the piggy bank of the 9.9%. But at the very same time that that's happening, we have this housing affordability crisis, right? Where just too many people can't find houses, can't afford to live, where the proportion of income, the median income that's spent on rent or on housing costs is astronomical. It's going up. Why is that happening? Well, it's actually a big part of it is the local power of the 9.9%. So if we had a rational national policy, you would basically say, well, land in a particular place has a lot of value. Many people want to live there. It's economically very productive to be there. So we should build a lot of housing there. And that makes sense from a universal or a national perspective. But if you happen to be one of the people living there and you're a nice big home, well, it doesn't make sense for you because you're suddenly going to be your house will lose a lot of value, or the scarcity value of what you have is going to go down, and so you will not be, have the privilege that you enjoyed before. Um, and of course, that's where the local power of the 9.9% steps in, and the my home is my castle, and it's private property. It's just me, and I deserve it, and I'm entitled to have my house appreciate at all times. And so then that becomes the house becomes kind of a sacred temple, and then that shows up not just in the economics, not just in NIMBYs fighting zoning laws, although that's a big part of what's going on. The NIMBYism is, as you know, in California, it's out of control. Um, but more than that, the house becomes this kind of strange sort of, sacred temple kind of thing where, people regard it as being just, more than just a house. It's sort of a way of being and a way of life. And, you know,
But also, what's
it's
happened is investors have come in and bought a lot of housing, right? And we have this problem of, I think we need like 37 million more housing units in the United States,
hmm,
and so there's like one of the interesting things is like most people who like build houses or work on building houses, like I think something 35% of them are undocumented immigrants. It's gonna be
yeah.
interesting how that's gonna play out, in a lot of different labor sectors, but in that one in particular, agriculture and that, it's gonna be a huge problem. But also people are moving to places like this whole thing of like people from California moving to Texas, right? And people from blue states moving to red states. It's not huge, but it is happening. And I wrote an article about this because you're just looking at, like, first of all, average lifespans. It's much lower in red states, right? Income much lower. Um, the the only thing is that lower is not lower is, well, there is lower inequality in some levels, right? In
I
some,
think that's mixed. I
yeah,
mean,
it's probably mixed.
yeah.
But in general, people are moving to places where they're gonna like die faster, right? For many different reasons.
It's not a good thing. I mean, if people are moving away from a productive place like California and they're moving to, well, Arizona. I mean, a lot of them are moving there. Arizona's not terrible, but it's generally not good. I mean, they're gonna make less money. They're also going to be arguably contributing less to the economy, and they're doing it just for the housing costs, basically. I mean, cost of living, but the housing is the biggest part of that. And I mean, I don't want to be too reductive here, but let me just be a little bit reductive and say that it just comes down to the fact that not enough houses are being built in California. I mean, that's the thing. Look, my sister lives in the LA area, and she's finally, able to build an additional dwelling unit because there's room for that on her property. But it took forever for that policy to come through. That should have gone through, 30 years ago. But they didn't do it because, whatever, preserve the character of the neighborhood or something like that. But there's room for many, many more people. I think this is the one thing that people don't understand is that urban density is not something to be scared of. And you can have much higher densities than we have in the United States, and actually, and people like it. They don't dislike it. So, having all these kind of this sort of spread out quasi-suburban thing all over the United States isn't actually, a great thing. Preserving these neighborhoods, frankly, isn't always that good of an idea.
But
So,
the dominant, not dominant, but a huge narrative, not just right-wing narrative, but also kind of just mainstream narrative is like the cities are these dens of crime, homelessness,
hmm.
of drugs. And
It's so American, man. It's so American and it's depressing. I mean, it's stupid. Because I mean, a city, I mean, that is civilization. I mean, like it or not, that's how human beings have kind of developed and evolved. And the suburb is frankly not one of the best forms of civilization. It's not terrible, but I mean, it's not like the ultimate destination of humanity. So, I mean, cities are great if they're done right. But it like somehow Americans have this thing, and it comes from America's history of racism
yeah,
mostly, but
yeah.
and other factors, presumably anti-immigration feeling and so on. Somehow, cities have been demonized, and it's just it's silly. It's idiotic.
Yeah, I mean, like the racist part, it started off, after the civil rights. Another thing people don't understand or think a lot about politics is like it used to be, Democrats, all the South was basically Democratic and voted for Republican. It was, I mean, Democrat, right, up to 1964, the Civil Rights Act. And then, a lot of the people, Nixon Southern strategy was partially like you can't just be openly racist if you want to keep some of the, Northern voters and what have you. And so you have to talk about crime, right, instead of talking about race, and then talk about cities, right, as the center of crime, right? And so the demonization of cities is partially a result of the Southern strategy, right, and the Republican strategy of trying to talk about race without talking about race, you know.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I think it's partially only in the sense that the other parts are basically part of the same explanation because the reason why the white people fled the cities they're not a mystery. I mean, it was called white flight for a reason. So the moment you had some number of black families move in, and the studies all show that there was in fact a specific number, like once it got to a certain percentage, that was it. The tipping point was reached, and all these white people fled the city. And so then, with only the new black population there, the city's then underinvested. They trashed the schools and whatever local resources there were, sent them off to the nice people going off to the suburbs, paid for the roads to take them out there, destroyed public transportation networks because that would have helped the people in the city. And the result is, yeah, the cities end up looking bad and the suburbs look good, but purely as a matter of racism and policy choices, regrettable policy choices.
How do you like using the frame of the 9.9%? Well, how would you respond to this narrative? This is kind of a common narrative is that the Democrats lost the working class because they became the party of the upper middle class professionals, and that they were unable to like provide policies that would help like the bottom 90%. And so it's kind of like this idea like if the liberal class doesn't um, help the working class, then the working class will move to the right, to a populist right wing revolution. So, like, in what ways do you think like the Democratic Party was taken over by the 9.9%?
So I don't doubt that there was a significant change in the Democratic Party, and that it was driven by absorbing significant numbers of people from the 9.9%. I don't think that that's actually the main explanation for our politics today, why the Democrats lost recently. Um, and I don't think that that actually has that much to do with their actual policies, but I do think it's a fact and it has a huge impact on perception and on messaging. So the Democratic Party, it definitely took in uh, significant numbers of educated professionals, and when you look at the numbers, it's pretty striking. Um, the the only analysis that I've seen, and there may be other ones, but the one that I've seen comes from Thomas Piketty, where he shows the top 10%, so roughly the 9.9% in income. Um, it went 60% for Hillary Clinton, if I remember correctly, in the 2016 election, and I think that's probably a fair measure. And I so that's definitely shaped Democratic Party politics. The other thing that's really shaped Democratic Party politics, which is part of that, has been this move towards what I think of as kind of virtue signaling, culture war, progressive activism posturing, right? Where the big issues are frankly not the big issues, to be perfectly blunt. Where instead of talking about things that I think really do matter, like the housing or like antitrust policy or education or healthcare, they end up talking a lot more about the rights of trans people and other issues that get some part of the progressive universe motivated, but that don't really resonate with a broader public. So yeah, that's happened, and it definitely has an impact on perception. But if you ask me, if you say, well, because they took in the 9.9%, they're not pushing the right sets of policies. I mean, I think it's mixed. They're not pushing a lot of policies that I think they could be pushing, such as some of the ones that we've talked about. But I don't think that that's because of the 9.9%. I think it's because the population as a whole has been so successfully disinformed that they view significant changes as essentially all being some form of socialism or communism or some incredibly undesirable thing. So if you ask me what the driving force is, why the bottom 90% shifted in a significant way, not universally, but at least a big part of them, mainly lower information, lower education, white people with some significant representation, non-white people. Why they shifted, I frankly don't think it has that much to do with the policy programs of either party. I think it has to do with the messaging. And frankly, the messaging is pretty disconnected from their actual interests and it's not based on what's going to serve them. So, and this is, Yeah, this is part of my own kind of pessimistic view about the current situation, but I do think that when you have a very unequal society where you have a tremendous amount of injustice, people are not very open to rational policy discussions. And unfortunately, our political discourse ends up being about stuff that doesn't matter and that, ends up not serving people.
Yeah,
So,
that's a really interesting point that you make in your book a couple times, which I wanted you to unpack, is that you said inequality undermines reason. You're kind of like hinting at that there, but like, what do you mean by that?
yeah, so it's a kind of there's a certain high level theory aspect of it, and there's a certain part of it that I think connects with the history of political thought and the American founding. So I think that we imagine that human rationality is a kind of a constant. And by rationality, I just mean something simple, like our ability to find the means that will be appropriate to our ends, or to select ends that actually serve us rather than, harm us or destroy us. So I just mean something very simple about rationality. We tend to assume that it's a constant across time and space, and that, humans have always been and always are as rational as they ever were. And I think that's inaccurate. I think that you can talk about the rationality of a society, and that does change, and you find societies behaving very unreasonably. And the main thing that drives that unreasonable behavior, I would say in the abstract, it's injustice, but more concretely, in a kind of highly monetized modern world, it's going to be economic inequality. Now, how does that happen? Well, it's because human beings are not, we know how they are partially rational. That is how they use heuristics and ways, shortcuts to arrive at conclusions that can be justified in a more lengthy way. So, and there are a lot of people writing about that kind of thing, the fast and slow thinking and all
Right.
that kind of stuff. And there are many other ways of talking about it. But, we all know that there's this kind of limitation in the way humans think. And so, one of the limitations is that most people figure out what's possible in the world by simply looking around them and saying, okay, well, if most humans I meet are between 5 feet and 7 feet tall, well, that's kind of the range, or and they make similar judgments with respect to talent, with respect to economic success, and so on. Now, what tends to happen is that as the society becomes more unequal and unjust, the judgments they make, their ability to sort of think about what's happening, become increasingly detached from reality. So if you're in a society where some people make 10,000 times more than other people, and you see that consistently, and then the people who don't make the money get, beaten up and trashed, well, then you start to form certain perceptions about the nature of the world and about the nature of humanity, and so on. So that's one part of the story, is that you have people who then develop skewed and sort of inadequate understandings of other people. There's a
Mm.
deeper part of it too, by the way, which would take us into Hegel and intersubjectivity and the importance of equal recognition. But let's bracket that, because there's another part of the story that's really important, and that's that what two other things stand in the way of human rationality, and that one is our when we get overwhelmed with emotions, the passions, and so on. In a highly unequal society, people are under a lot of stress. They become angry and resentful, and that becomes an obstacle to rationality. And I think we just see that. I mean, you have rage running throughout American society. It's rage that's really driven more by local circumstances, by the fact that your health insurance company is screwing you, or that your employer is beating up on you, or all kinds of other stresses in life. But that sets people up collectively as targets for grievance politics, and so we're seeing a tremendous amount of that. And then the other end of it is that you have a group of people who are tremendously motivated to promote unreason, who are tremendously motivated to exploit these grievances, and that is the 0.1%. So as they become more wealthy, as their wealth comes more under attack, um, they need more and more, or they feel that they need more and more protection. They develop their own paranoias. They develop very unreasonable ideas about their own merits. But then, of course, they also, at some level, are, aware of their they have this sense of false consciousness because they know that, actually they probably aren't really worth $300 billion dollars or whatever it is. So they are highly motivated to defend their unearned privilege. Now, they can't really defend it with reason because uh, it's unreasonable. Like,
Mhm.
it's just unreasonable that someone should have $300 billion dollars, especially when they make the money by gouging, governments, by, setting up monopolies, by, doing any number of other silly tricks, right, that don't actually contribute to society. So, since they can't defend it with reason, they have to defend it with unreason. What do? They invest heavily in disinformation networks. They go out and they buy dozens of think tanks. They form federalist societies and, create an affirmative action program for people who will be, true to the ideology that says that rich people will get everything that they deserve. And what does that do? The net effect of that is to promote unreason in society. And if I can finish this soliloquy with a more general point, I think this applies throughout human history. So I think that religion is a complicated thing. It has many different manifestations. But let's just say simplistically that there's a hard kind of it. There's a very tough, authoritarian form of religion. And that kind of religion shows up over and over again throughout history whenever you've got big piles of money to defend. And it's a consistent pattern, and it's the way in which, kings and popes and Mesopotamian priestesses and all kinds of other oligarchs of the past maintained power. And frankly, I think we're seeing a version of that now. We're seeing a version of that kind of spread of unreason that ultimately is being funded by a group of paranoid people who are worried about losing their unearned purchase in society. So
Yeah, I
that's
think another factor which is related, and I totally agree with that. I mean, a great example of the religion thing is like in Saudi Arabia when they discovered oil, like they became super religious, like, and they knew that was a way of controlling the society. And yes, you see that throughout history. And so I always try to point out, like, people like to talk about like these polarized ideologies, left, right, liberal, conservative, but really we have like at least five major ideologies, right? And liberal, conservative, right, left, and I would say centrist. And the Republican Party is this strange coalition of opposite ideologies, you could say. You have this moral or this conservative fundamentalist religion side, and then you have this amoral capitalist side. And they've been able to form this coalition of opposites partially by demonizing the alternative, as is a major way of doing it, but also by claiming like shared victimhood, which is interesting. If you One of the biggest indicators if someone is a Trump voter in the last election was whether they think that white males are discriminated against more than other groups. Okay, so there is this kind of like Trump, the ultimate like victim of the deep state, victim of taxes, victim of the law, victim of everyone, of political correctness. And a lot of working class people identify with this victim narrative. And it's also, religions are often based on like some martyrdom, some scene of traumatic victimhood. And so there is this bonding over victimhood, bonding over the hated rival. But getting So I agree with you in one way. This is the fight that Democratic Party is having now, right? Do we double down on identity politics, or do we find a way to talk about like class or jobs or economic issues? Or can we try to do both at the same time? Because the Democratic Party is also a coalition of two very, I would say, in ways opposing ideologies. One is the leftist ideology is mostly an ideology that is centered on groups and group competition and group grievances and group protests. And the centrist is more of like the 9.9%, which is more of like moderate reform. They don't want total, like, they kind of profit from the system, so they don't want the system to be disbanded, but they also know there's problems with the system, so they'll go for like some reform and moderate changes in the tax rate or in something, but basically they don't want the system to change, right? They want the status quo with some improvements. And that's very different from what a lot of people on the left think, is that we need these radical transformations, radical changes, and that we have to focus on the people who are the most disadvantaged, at least like socially. So the battle then, so there is this battle within the Democratic Party, I would say, between the upper middle class professional group and also the non-white working class people, right? So I don't think the Democratic Party can say like we're just giving up on identity politics because it still needs that coalition with the left. And so the question is, how can they both pursue, economic justice and also like not ignore that there still is racism and discrimination, because the other side is going to take advantage of racism and discrimination in order to recruit working class people. So you can't just abandon that struggle or like not point to it because it's being used. Like when Trump said a plane goes down, a train says it's because of Trump says it's because of DEI. Like totally. So you might not like support the effects of DEI policies, but you also don't want to allow it to be demonized because it's such an easy target for the right. So the question is like, how do you like maneuver that dialectic? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I'm not a like political tactician, so I mean, I would.
Don't you have a degree in political philosophy? I have a degree in political philosophy. Don't you have a degree in political philosophy?
Well, man, technically, my doctoral degree was in just philosophy, the history of philosophy. So, if you want 19th century German philosophy, I guess I'm qualified to tell you about that. Um, and I did do an undergraduate degree in politics, but that was really about political philosophy. Look, no, I'm as happy as the next person to comment on political tactics. I just don't know if my word should be particularly influential. But look, my sense is that the identity politics thing, to some degree, is a narrative imposed from the outside. I mean, the Republicans have been absolutely monomaniacal, I think, in insisting that all the Democrats care about is which identity group you belong to and when you're going to have your sex change operation. So that's to some degree, it's an outside vision. It does have some basis in reality. And I think it has failed. I mean, I think it doesn't work. And I'm not sure I agree with you that they need to keep it in order to hold on to their progressive base, because frankly, the progressive base has nowhere to go. And also because I don't know that promoting anti-discrimination through group identities has actually been all that effective in creating a more just society. I think that we should all aim for a society in which people are not discriminated against, and the idea, that world that Martin Luther King describes in his dream. But and we shouldn't by any means relinquish that, and we should definitely hold any party, and that means the Republican Party, that is trying to turn the clock back and sort of, bring back discrimination and, all their anti-DEI stuff. We should call it out for what it is, which is an indirect way of bringing the old racist thing back. Um, so I think that this is actually an opportunity to focus on the economic fundamentals, and I don't mean class. I think that the idea of building it all around the working class is also a mistake. It's a mistake because historically Americans just don't work that way. They don't, nobody in America, I mean, I'm generalizing because I'm sure there are people who do this, but broadly speaking, the message that, you deserve protection because you're a member of the working class, I just don't think really works. I think that Americans are just too individualistic and we have to kind of meet them where they are and say, okay, you deserve protection because you're great and you do a lot of good work, and it's not being fairly compensated. And when you get your dignity back and when you become part of a society that respects you, then well, then you'll be happy. So I think that there's a positive message you can put around
Yeah.
economic policies that goes beyond just saying, "Hey, you're workers, and let's all get united." That said, look, I think that bringing unions back in some way is absolutely central. And creating more worker rights. Like getting rid of the ridiculous non-compete clauses and all this other bullshit that is used to kind of strip workers of any real power. All that has to be addressed. It's just I don't see it as being best pursued with a sort of workers' party kind of style where you say you're standing up for the proletariat or something like that.
Yeah, but it's, like I
I
saw with
don't
the
actually
union
believe in
thing. Yeah.
socioeconomic classes in some level. I mean, that's why it's kind of paradoxical. I wrote a book called The 9.9% because I actually don't think that I think class is way too simplistic a concept for analyzing the way a society works, and that classes are not conscious of themselves. They're not agents. They don't act in history. So yeah.
But you need a concept like that in order to like talk about the things that conflict with that concept. And you need something to start with. You need some ground to have a common understanding, to frame things, to have a perspective. That's what I found so effective about your work. It brings together all these issues around this group, which, yes, we can call into question the exact definition and like historically and what have you, but you need some type of like theoretical organizing principle in order to focus people's attention and then have something to bounce things off of, because otherwise, it's just too much information, too much noise. And I think like that's what, I think your book does. So, I'll close. I'll just recommend people to buy the book and to read it. And hopefully, we can continue this conversation in the future. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Bob. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Stop.
Cheers.